The drum circle formed just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the South Dakota sky in shades of orange and deep purple. It was the summer of 1962, and 12-year-old Joseph Standing Bear was about to receive his name in a ceremony that his family had conducted for countless generations. His grandfather, a respected elder named Thomas, stood at the center of the gathering, holding a sacred pipe and wearing the ceremonial regalia that had been passed down through 5 generations. Nearly 200 people from the Pine Ridge Reservation had come to witness this moment. Extended family, clan members, friends, and community leaders who understood that a naming ceremony wasn't just about one boy. It was about connecting past, present, and future, about affirming who the Lakota people were and would continue to be. Joseph's grandmother had spent 3 months preparing his ceremonial outfit, a vest covered in intricate beadwork depicting eagles and buffalo, each bead sewn by hand in patterns that told stories. His mother had fasted and prayed for 4 days before the ceremony, seeking guidance about which name would be revealed for her son. The entire community had contributed. Some brought food for the feast that would follow, others helped construct the ceremonial arbor, and the drummers had practiced the specific songs that would be sung during the naming ritual. "Your name is Tunatanka Wangbli Buffalo Eagle," Thomas announced in Lakota, his voice carrying across the gathering. "You will have the strength of the buffalo and the vision of the eagle. This is who you are. This is who you will become." The drums thundered. Voices rose in song. Women gave the tremolo, that high-pitched ululating cry of celebration. Joseph felt tears on his face, but they were tears of joy, of belonging, of understanding his place in a web of relationships that stretched back to the beginning of time. What Joseph didn't know, what none of them could have fully understood in that golden summer evening, was that he was participating in something that would become increasingly rare. By the time Joseph had children of his own in the 1982, naming ceremonies on many reservations had dwindled to occasional events rather than the regular celebrations they had once been. The songs would be partially forgotten. The elaborate preparations would seem too difficult for families struggling with poverty and dislocation. The community gatherings would shrink as people scattered, looking for work and opportunity off the reservation. The 1950 and 1960 marked a turning point for Native American ceremonial life. These decades sat at the intersection of profound change after the termination policies and relocation programs of the 1950 before the cultural revival movements of the 1970. During this narrow window, many traditional celebrations that had survived centuries of suppression finally began to fade, not through direct prohibition, but through the slower erosion of poverty, cultural pressure, and the scattering of communities. The powwow tradition, which had once been the heartbeat of Plains Indian life, was struggling during these years. In the 1930 and 1940, powwows had begun to revive after decades of government suppression. By the 1950, they were regular features of summer life on many reservations, multi-day gatherings where tribes came together to dance, sing, feast, trade, court, and celebrate their continuing existence. The grand entry, when all the dancers entered the arena in full regalia following the flag bearers and veterans, could bring tears to the eyes of even the most stoic observers. The sight of hundreds of dancers in traditional clothing, moving to drums that seemed to make the earth itself pulse with life, was a powerful affirmation of cultural survival. But by the mid-1960s, the character of powwows was changing. Martha Red Cloud, a Lakota woman who had been a champion fancy shawl dancer in her youth, remembered the shift with sadness. "In the 50s, the powwows were for us," she said in an interview conducted in 1995. "We danced for ourselves, for our ancestors, for our children. The songs were all traditional songs my grandmother knew, songs that had been sung for generations. The regalia was made by our families. Every piece had meaning. It wasn't a show. It was who we were. But then things started changing. White tourists wanted to see authentic Indians, and some communities started putting on powwows for them. The dances got shorter because tourists had short attention spans. Some of the more sacred dances stopped being performed in public. People started making regalia specifically to look impressive to outsiders, not to carry family and clan meanings. The songs got mixed up, traditional songs mixed with newer songs, songs from different tribes all blended together. It wasn't bad, exactly, but it was different. Something was being lost. The traditional calendar of ceremonies was also breaking down. Many tribes had organized their entire year around a cycle of seasonal celebrations, each with specific purposes and protocols. Among the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, for instance, the ceremonial calendar was extraordinarily complex, with dances and rituals timed to agricultural cycles, solstices, and feast days. Each ceremony had been performed for centuries, passed down through religious societies whose members spent years learning the intricate songs, dances, and prayers. By the 1,960 seconds, this ancient system was under stress. Young people were leaving the pueblos for education and employment. The religious societies that performed the ceremonies were having trouble recruiting new members. The Santa Fe Railroad and later Route 66 had brought increasing numbers of tourists, and pueblos faced difficult decisions about which ceremonies to keep private and which to allow outsiders to witness. Some ceremonies were simplified or shortened, others were performed less frequently. A few simply stopped being performed at all. The tourist wanted to see corn dance, buffalo dance, but they didn't understand what they were seeing, explained a Pueblo elder who requested anonymity. These aren't performances. These are prayers. When we dance, we're praying for rain, for good harvest, for the well-being of our people. But tourist sees it like a show. They take pictures, they talk during the dance, they don't follow the protocols, so we had to make choices. Some dances we stopped letting outsiders see, some dances we only did in abbreviated form, and some dances we just stopped doing because we didn't have enough people who knew them anymore. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked the transition from childhood to adulthood were also fading in many communities. These ceremonies had been centerpieces of Native American life, elaborate rituals that could last for days and involved entire communities in preparing a young person for adult responsibilities. Among the Apache, the sunrise ceremony for girls was one of the most important events in the community calendar, a 4-day ritual that transformed a girl into a woman through dancing, singing, and sacred rituals that reenacted the Apache creation story. Violet Longreach, a Mescalero Apache woman, had her sunrise ceremony in 1959, and she was one of the last in her extended family to have the full traditional ceremony. It was 4 days of dancing, from sunrise to sunset, she remembered. My godmother danced with me, teaching me the steps, encouraging me when I was exhausted. The medicine man sang the sacred songs, the ones that connect us to white-painted woman. The whole community was there, cooking, singing, praying, supporting me. My family spent months preparing, spent money they didn't have on the feast, on my ceremonial dress, on gifts for everyone who helped. It was the most important thing that ever happened to me. I became a woman in the traditional way. But when Violet's daughters reached the appropriate age in the 1,980 seconds, they didn't have sunrise ceremonies. It was too expensive, Violet explained, her voice heavy with regret. My husband and I were struggling just to keep food on the table. We lived in Albuquerque, away from the reservation, away from our extended family. Who would have come? Who would have known the songs? The medicine men who knew the complete ceremony were getting old, and some had died. We talked about it, we wanted to do it, but it just seemed impossible. So my daughters had birthday parties instead. White-style parties with cake and presents. They became women, but not in the way I did. And something was lost. The seasonal Thanksgiving ceremonies that had marked the passage of the year were also disappearing. The green corn ceremony, practiced by many southeastern tribes, had been a major annual event, a time for renewal, for settling disputes, for giving thanks for the harvest, for lighting the sacred fire anew. Among the Haudenosaunee-Iroquois people, the midwinter ceremony was the most important event of the year, lasting for days and involving specific rituals that had to be performed in correct sequence to ensure the well-being of the people for the coming year. By the 1960 seconds, many of these seasonal ceremonies were being compressed or simplified. The traditional practice of stopping all work for days to focus on ceremony was incompatible with modern work schedules. People had jobs in town and couldn't take a week off for traditional celebrations. Schools wouldn't excuse children for what they considered cultural events. The result was that ceremonies that had once lasted for days were reduced to single evenings. Rituals that had specific timing requirements were moved to convenient weekends. Sacred protocols were abbreviated to fit modern schedules. The midwinter ceremony was supposed to happen when the Pleiades reached a certain point in the sky, explained Howard Skyhorse, a Mohawk traditionalist. It wasn't about convenience. It was about cosmic timing. But by the 60s, we were doing it on whatever weekend worked for the most people. And when you change the timing, when you compress the rituals, when you skip parts because people have to get back to work, is it still the same ceremony? Are we still receiving the same blessings? These were questions we struggled with, and I don't think we ever found good answers. The traditional marriage ceremonies were also changing profoundly. In many tribes, marriage hadn't been a single event, but a process that could take months and involved both families extensively. There were gift exchanges, ceremonial preparations, public announcements, and rituals that bound two families together in relationships of mutual obligation and support. Among the Navajo, a traditional wedding involved specific ceremonies and songs, the building of a ceremonial hogan, and the serving of a ceremonial corn mush that the couple ate together to symbolize their union. By the 1960 seconds, most Native American couples were getting married in churches or at county courthouses. The traditional ceremonies, if performed at all, were often abbreviated affairs, shorn of the elaborate preparations and multi-day celebrations that had once been standard. Some couples tried to incorporate traditional elements into otherwise conventional weddings, creating hybrid ceremonies that acknowledged their heritage while conforming to mainstream expectations. When I got married in 1966, we had a church wedding because that's what my wife wanted, remembered George Whitebull, a Crow man. But afterward, my grandfather took me aside and said, "That's not how we do it. That's the white man's way." He was disappointed. In the traditional Crow way, there would have been gift exchanges between the families. There would have been feasts. There would have been announcements and ceremonies that established our new relationship to both families. Instead, we said some words in front of a preacher and signed a paper. It was legal, but it wasn't ours. The memorial customs and ways of honoring the dead were also being transformed. Many tribes had elaborate protocols for dealing with death-specific mourning periods, giveaway ceremonies where the deceased's possessions were distributed to others, memorial feasts held at prescribed intervals, and spiritual practices designed to help the deceased's spirit journey to the next world. These practices had been developed over thousands of years and reflected deep spiritual beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the continuing relationship between the living and the dead. Modern funeral practices, largely borrowed from European American customs, were replacing these traditional approaches by the 1960 seconds. Native people were being buried in cemeteries rather than traditional burial grounds. Christian funeral services were replacing traditional mourning rituals. The memorial giveaways, where families distributed the deceased's possessions to honor their memory, were becoming rare, partly because families had little to give away, partly because the spiritual meaning behind the practice was being forgotten. When my grandmother died in 1962, we had a traditional giveaway, recalled Sarah Longtree, a Lakota woman. The family gave away almost everything she had owned: her quilts, her dishes, her jewelry, even her furniture. People thought we were crazy. Why would you give away things you could use or sell? But that was our way. You honor the dead by giving, not by keeping. You free their spirit by releasing their possessions. But when my mother died in 1985, we had a regular funeral and nobody expected a giveaway. The tradition had died with my grandmother's generation. The traditional healing ceremonies were also fading, replaced by modern medicine and hospitals. For thousands of years, Native Americans had practiced sophisticated healing traditions that combined herbal medicine, spiritual healing, ceremony, and community support. Different practitioners specialized in different types of healing. Some worked with physical ailments, others with spiritual or emotional problems. Healing ceremonies could be elaborate affairs, lasting for days and involving singers, dancers, and the entire community in creating an environment of prayer and positive energy focused on the sick person's recovery. The Navajo Beauty Way ceremony, for instance, was a 9-day healing ritual that involved intricate sand paintings, hundreds of songs that had to be performed in exact sequence, and the participation of extended family and community members. It was expensive. Families might spend thousands of dollars in 1,960 seconds money to pay the medicine man, feed everyone who attended, and provide the necessary ceremonial materials. But it was considered essential for certain types of illness, particularly those believed to have spiritual causes. By the 1,960 seconds, fewer families could afford these elaborate ceremonies, and fewer young people were training to become medicine people. The knowledge was incredibly complex. Some healing ceremonies required the memorization of hundreds of songs, prayers, and ritual procedures that could take decades to learn completely. Medicine men and women were growing old, and they weren't finding enough apprentices to pass their knowledge to. "My grandfather was a medicine man," said Robert Sinajini, a Navajo man interviewed in 1998. "He knew several healing ceremonies, had spent 40 years learning them. He tried to teach me, but I was young. I wanted to leave the reservation. I wanted a modern life. The ceremonies seemed old-fashioned, irrelevant. By the time I was old enough to realize what we were losing, my grandfather was too old to teach. He died in 1972, and most of what he knew died with him. I carry that regret every day." The traditional educational ceremonies, where knowledge was formally passed from one generation to the next, were also disappearing. Many tribes had specific rituals for initiating young people into adult knowledge ceremonies, where they would be taught tribal history, spiritual teachings, proper behavior, and their responsibilities to the community. These weren't casual lessons, but formal transmissions of sacred knowledge, often involving fasting, prayer, and ritual ordeals that tested the young person's commitment and readiness to receive important teachings. Among the Pueblo peoples, young men were initiated into Kiva societies through elaborate ceremonies that could take place over years. They would learn the songs, dances, and prayers associated with their particular Kiva, gaining deeper understanding of their spiritual responsibilities with each level of initiation. This system ensured that ceremonial knowledge was preserved and transmitted, that there would always be trained people who could perform the necessary rituals for the community's well-being. But by the 1,960 seconds, this system was breaking down. Young people were leaving for boarding schools, for military service, for college, for jobs. They weren't present for the initiation ceremonies, weren't available to learn the teachings. The Kiva societies found themselves with aging membership and few young initiates. Some ceremonies stopped being performed because there weren't enough trained people to perform them correctly. The traditional systems of dispute resolution and community justice often involved ceremonial elements, rituals designed to restore harmony, heal relationships, and reintegrate wrongdoers into the community. These weren't punishment-focused like American criminal justice, but healing-focused, aimed at making things right rather than making someone suffer. Ceremonies might involve public confession, restitution, spiritual cleansing, and reconciliation rituals that brought together everyone affected by a wrong action. Western legal systems had largely replaced these traditional approaches by the 1,960 seconds. Tribal courts, where they existed, generally followed Anglo-American legal procedures. The ceremonial and spiritual dimensions of justice were lost. When someone committed a crime, they went to jail, not to a healing ceremony. The focus shifted from restoring community harmony to punishing individual wrongdoing. In the old way, if someone did wrong, the whole community would come together to make it right, explained Elizabeth Redhawk, a tribal court advocate. There would be ceremonies, talking circles, spiritual healing. The person who did wrong would remain part of the community, would be helped to change their behavior. But with the white man's justice system, we just lock people up. We remove them from the community. We punish, but we don't heal. We satisfy the law, but we don't restore harmony. The traditional first food ceremonies, which honored the return of seasonal foods and maintained respectful relationships with the plant and animal beings that sustained the people, were also fading. The first salmon ceremony of Pacific Northwest tribes, the first berries ceremony, the first corn ceremony. These were spiritual practices that acknowledged that food was a gift, that humans had responsibilities to the natural world, that eating wasn't just a physical act but a sacred relationship. As Native people moved away from traditional food gathering and subsistence practices, these ceremonies lost their immediate relevance. When you bought your salmon at the supermarket instead of catching it from the river, when your corn came in cans instead of from your own garden, the ceremonial acknowledgement of first food seemed less essential. The spiritual dimension of eating, the idea that food had spirit, that taking life required ceremony and gratitude, was being lost. My grandmother would never eat the first berries of the season without ceremony, remembered Louise Blackwater, a Confederated Tribes member from the Pacific Northwest. We'd go picking together, and when we found the first ripe ones, she'd pick them carefully, say prayers, leave an offering of tobacco. Then we'd bring them home, and she'd prepare them in a specific way, and the family would eat them together while she told stories about berry picking from when she was young. It made eating sacred. But my children? They eat berries from plastic containers from Costco. How do you teach them that berries have spirits when they've never picked one from a bush? The traditional weather ceremonies, performed to encourage rain or ensure good growing conditions, were becoming rare by the 1,960 seconds. These ceremonies had been taken very seriously. Communities would fast and pray, perform specific dances, and conduct rituals that had been proven over centuries to maintain proper relationships with the weather beings. Among the Pueblo peoples, the rain dances were central to communal life, performed at specific times according to the ceremonial calendar. Modern skepticism about the efficacy of these ceremonies, combined with the adoption of Christian beliefs that discouraged what were seen as pagan practices, led to their decline. Some ceremonies continued, but more as cultural performances than as serious spiritual practices. The deep belief that human beings could, through proper ceremony and prayer, influence weather patterns, was being replaced by a more secular worldview, where weather was something that happened to you, not something you had a relationship with. The traditional ceremonies of thanksgiving to the Creator and to the spirit beings who helped humans were also being simplified or forgotten. Many tribes had elaborate protocols for giving thanks, not just once a year at harvest time, but throughout the year as different blessings were received. Thanks were given to the sun, the rain, the earth, the four directions, the plant beings, the animal beings, the ancestors. Each required specific prayers, songs, and sometimes offerings. As Christianity became more dominant in Native communities, these multiple ceremonies of thanksgiving were often reduced to grace, said before meals, borrowing Christian forms. The rich ceremonial calendar that had structured the year around multiple Thanksgiving observances was replaced by the single American Thanksgiving holiday, which had no connection to traditional Native spiritual practices. The Vision Quest tradition, practiced by many Plains tribes, was becoming less common by the 1,960 seconds. This ceremony involved a young person, usually a young man, though some tribes included young women, going alone to a remote place for days of fasting and prayer, seeking a vision that would provide spiritual guidance for their life. The vision quest was a profound experience that marked the transition to spiritual adulthood and often determined a person's path in life. But vision quests required things that were increasingly scarce, sacred locations that were undisturbed, elders who knew how to prepare someone for the ordeal and interpret the visions received, a community context that valued this type of spiritual experience, and time. Young people, in the 1,960 seconds, were being educated in Western schools that taught them to be skeptical of visions and spiritual experiences. They were being prepared for jobs in the modern economy, not for lives as spiritual seekers. "I never went on a vision quest," admitted Robert Fasthorse, a Lakota man born in 1950. "By the time I was old enough, it just wasn't something that was being done much anymore. My father had done one when he was young, but he never offered to prepare me for one. I think he wasn't sure it was relevant to the life I was going to live. And maybe he was right. I became an accountant, worked in an office in Rapid City for 30 years. Would a vision quest have helped me with that? But still, I feel like I missed something important, something that would have connected me to my ancestors in a way nothing else could." The traditional gift-giving ceremonies, like the potlatch of Northwest Coast tribes, or the giveaway ceremonies common among Plains tribes, were also fading. These ceremonies had been central to Native American economics and social organization. They redistributed wealth, established social status, created bonds of obligation and mutual support, and demonstrated that generosity and giving were more valued than accumulation and keeping. The U.S. government had actually banned potlatches from 1,885 to 1,951, seeing them as wasteful and contrary to the accumulation ethic they wanted to instill in Native people. Even after the ban was lifted, potlatches never fully recovered their central role in Northwest Coast life. The elaborate preparations, the accumulation of gifts to give away, the days-long celebrations, all of this was difficult to maintain in a modern economy where people worked for wages and had little surplus to give away. The traditional ceremonies of adoption and making of relatives were also becoming rare. Many tribes had formal ceremonies for adopting outsiders into the tribe or for creating kinship bonds between individuals or families. These weren't legal adoptions in the Western sense, but spiritual and social ceremonies that established real relationships with rights and obligations on both sides. "My grandfather adopted 3 people during his life," remembered Martha Whitehorse. "These weren't children, they were adults who had shown respect and commitment to our people. Through ceremony, they became part of our family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. But that practice pretty much died with his generation. We don't adopt people anymore in the traditional way. The ceremonies are forgotten. Even the protocols around sacred sites and sacred objects were being lost. Traditional knowledge about which places were sacred, what ceremonies should be performed there, and when and how to approach these places was held by specific individuals and passed down carefully. But as these knowledge keepers died without full transmission to the next generation, sacred sites became just places on maps, their spiritual significance forgotten by all but a few elders. Yet even as these traditions faded during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, there were people who fought to preserve them. Elders who insisted on performing ceremonies even when only a handful of people attended. Families who scraped together resources to give their children traditional coming-of-age ceremonies. Communities that continued their powwows even when it seemed like they might die out entirely. Teachers who recorded songs and stories, hoping that future generations might rediscover them. And in the 1,970 seconds, something remarkable began to happen. The Red Power movement, the American Indian movement, and a broader cultural revival began to spark renewed interest in traditional practices. Young Native people who had been raised in cities started coming back to reservations, asking to learn the old ways. Ceremonies that had nearly died out were revived. Powwows grew larger and more frequent. Languages began to be taught in schools. Sacred sites were reclaimed and protected. Joseph Standing Bear, the boy who had received his name in that sunset ceremony in 1962, became one of the leaders of this revival. By the 1,990 seconds, he was an elder himself, teaching young people traditional songs and helping families conduct naming ceremonies. His children and grandchildren all had traditional names, received in ceremonies that drew from the traditions he had learned, but adapted to the realities of modern life. We can't go back to exactly how things were, Joseph reflected in a 1998 interview. The world has changed too much. But we can honor the spirit of our traditions while adapting them to present circumstances. The key is understanding why we did these ceremonies, what they meant, what they accomplished. When we understand that, we can find ways to carry the essence forward, even if some of the forms have to change. In tribal community centers and on powwow grounds across Indian country today, you can see the results of this cultural revival. Naming ceremonies happen regularly again. Coming-of-age ceremonies are being revived and adapted. Powwows draw thousands of participants. Traditional healing practices are being integrated with modern medicine. Languages are being taught to children. Young people are learning songs and dances that almost died out. But there's no denying that much was lost during those critical decades. Ceremonies that were once common are now rare. Songs that everyone knew are now sung only by specialists. Protocols that were once second nature have to be carefully taught. The cultural knowledge that was lost when elders died in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds without fully passing on their teachings can never be completely recovered. The story of Native American ceremonial traditions in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds is ultimately a story about resilience and resistance, about loss and survival, about the power of culture to endure even under the most difficult circumstances. It's a reminder that traditions don't disappear because people stop caring about them, but because the conditions that sustain them change, making it harder and harder to continue practices that require time, resources, knowledge, and community that are no longer easily available. And it's a reminder that cultural preservation is active work, not passive memory. The ceremonies that survived did so because people fought for them, sacrificed for them, insisted on their importance even when the world was telling them to modernize and assimilate. Every naming ceremony performed today, every powwow dance, every song sung in a native language is an act of resistance and an affirmation that native peoples and native cultures are still here, still vital, still connected to traditions that stretch back to the beginning of time. As the sun sets on powwow grounds across Indian country today, the drums still sound. They echo the same rhythms that Joseph Standing Bear heard at his naming ceremony in 1962, the same rhythms that his grandfather heard and his grandfather's grandfather. The thread remains unbroken, thinner perhaps than it once was, worn by passage through difficult years, but unbroken still. And as long as the drums sound, as long as dancers move to those ancient rhythms, as long as elders pass traditions to children, the circle of Native American ceremonial life continues.